It's February 23rd, it's about 10 o'clock in the evening, and I'm out in the shed having a look at my gearbox, which is finally turned up. And the initial signs seem pretty good. The gearbox doesn't have any holes in it, which is a start. It's a bit grubby, so it needs a bit of a clean, but I've been doing the prep work ahead of giving it a full degrease at the weekend. So what have I done? Well, the first thing I did was I've loosened off all the nuts and bolts that are holding bits and pieces on. For example, there's my reversing light switch, so that's now loose, ready for the new one to go in, but I'm going to leave it in while I degrease. There's my slave cylinder, my CSC, that's in pretty good nick. It's not rattling or anything like the old one was, so that's actually pretty good. I needn't have bothered changing that, or the reverse light switch either for that matter, and if I hadn't bought the two of those I could have saved myself 80 quid, but now that I have them, I'm happy to put them in. The other thing I've done is, from the old gearbox, this was the sort of shift mechanism off the new gearbox. I've taken that off and put the one off the old one in, simply because it was a bit smoother, it ran a bit better. That one's a bit scored on the inside, it was quite stiff, so I took it off, little circlip, took that off there, and then popped the new one on, and then now it's shifting away very smoothly and going very positively through all the gears. There was a plastic shroud on this, which I've removed to give my access to it, and I'll put all that back on after I've degreased. It came with a spare engine mount, so I took that off as well, because it's hard to get it into the car with that in place. So the last things that I need to do, oh yes, the other thing I've done is I've loosened off the little nut for, there it is in there, for filling it full of oil, because again it's just an easier job to do here on the bench rather than underneath the car. So the only things I've left to do now are to swap out the CSC, but I'm going to leave it in there while I degrease it, and then I'm going to cap these while these are the sockets where the drive shafts go through. I'm going to cap those so that it doesn't get any water or grit in there, and then when the gearbox is dry, I'm going to pop out the seals and replace them. Again, as I have the gearbox out, it just makes sense to do that. So all in all, it's looking pretty positive, and it's all lining up nicely to be able to put this in at the weekend. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I could have gotten away without having to replace my CSC, because the one that's in this gearbox is fine. The other one was knackered. And also the reverse light switch, that's about 20 quid for one of those. So the one that's in the car is working fine, I would suspect, so that's another 20 quid. So that's about 80 pounds I could have saved. And also, there's the clutch itself. This is the old clutch, if I can lift it off. So that's the old clutch itself. That's about 6 mil on that. The change point is about 4 mil, so there's probably another 10 or 15,000 miles in that at least. But as I have the whole thing off, it made sense to change it. So that's probably 180 quid's worth I could have saved there. And the gearbox itself was 220. So if I wanted to be mercenary about this, the first thing I should have done really was change the gearbox, and then I would have seen that the CSC was okay, the clutch was okay, the reverse light switch was okay. Then I could have just, and the seals, I could have not changed those, and I could save myself about 200 quid, and the gearbox delivered was 220. But it wouldn't be the right thing to do with a nice new 64,000 mile, exact same mileage gearbox, plus a new clutch, plus a new thrust bearing and a CSC, plus reverse switch, seals, all that. This gearbox is good for another 100,000 miles. It's the right thing to do, and it'll be a better car at the end of it. So no regrets, I guess. Just happy to have the bloody thing back in the car and working properly. And what's the best thing about it is not having that worrying, nagging thing in the back of my head that the gearbox that I have in the car just isn't right. So I'm almost at the point now where I'm ready to put the gearbox back in, but I've just got one or two last jobs to do. Apart from cleaning it, I'm waiting for my degreaser to arrive, and then I'll give it a good clean down. But before I do that, I need to replace these seals, these drive shaft seals, because if I don't and they leak down the line, it's just not a good look. This sort of future proofs it. Oops, for the next owner. It's quite tricky to get out these things. Actually, you know what? This would be easier if I stood the gearbox up on its bell housing. Excuse me. Pardon me, everybody. All right. Sorry you can't see this, but you've seen the basis of what I'm doing. Right. at the point now where I think it's about to pop out, so I can pull it back over again. So all I've been doing is just moving my prize bar around to different locations, whoop, so that I can get it out, and you can see how it's been in there a long time. There's this little layer of surface corrosion on it, and you can see the rust coming through that there. And putting the new ones in is as easy as just lining it up and tapping it in. Well, that's easy in theory. In practice, you have to line it up in such a way that it goes in square and true, and then you've got to tap it in such a way that it doesn't damage the bearing itself. This is a little easier when it's a flat surface, of course, but for the sake of demonstration, I'll do it here on the side. And that, as you can see there, is pretty much square all the way around it now. So that, I think, is that. My 2 seals in. I think I'm happy with those. Job done. The very last thing I was waiting on, which was my engine degreaser, turned up this afternoon on the doorstep. So came out, gave the engine a quick degrease. It's now about 6 o'clock. I think I've got about half an hour of light left. So what I'm going to do now is, this is pretty much done now. Everything is ready to go. Everything's prepped. The last job I needed to do was put in the new CSC, the new slave cylinder. So that's in there now. 3 little bolts, hold that in place. 1, 2, 3. 8 to 10 newton meters of torque is all they need, so it isn't a big job getting them in. And that's it. Gearbox is currently upside down on this pallet. I'm going to flip it around, wriggle it in under the car, wrestle it into position, and if I can get the gearbox on the car, even loosely, and I don't need to get every single bolt on there, but if I can get a couple of bolts on there holding it in position, and if I can then get the engine mount in situ and get the car off its blocks and completely free tomorrow, it'll clear out all the space under the car that's currently taken up with engine supports. If I can get all that access back tomorrow, then that'll make the job of buttoning everything down, getting all the hoses and cables and supports and all that kind of stuff, it'll make all that go much, much easier. And it means that I can head into tomorrow with a sort of a with a more detailed frame of mind, rather than this is a grunt job. And so I don't know about other people, but I tend to, when I've got a grunt job to do, I tend to be focused on the grunty thing, and I gear myself up for it. Whereas if I've got a more pernickety job, if I got a fiddly job to do, I go into a different mindset for that. So to get all the grunty stuff done tonight would be great, and then I can really crack on with just the more fine and detailed stuff tomorrow. So that's my plan. As I say, half an hour of light, so if you excuse me, I gotta crack on. I came out this morning with my cup of coffee to have a quick look at how things were going. That's well cold, because that was 3 hours ago. Last night I got the gearbox in, and I held it in place with a couple of bolts, just because it was in situ and I wanted to keep it there. And that was my objective last night, get the gearbox in position, so that this morning when I came out, I can not just think about what needs to go back together, but also the order in which it goes back together. Because if you get it in the wrong order, it's incredibly frustrating that you've got to undo things, and some of what is involved here is really fiddly. So I have 8 of the bolts holding the gearbox in now. The ones, ironically, that are the trickiest are the ones at the top, because of all this cabling and hosing and all this stuff that's going on at the top of the engine. Access is really tricky, whereas down below you can see them there. These bolts are a doddle to put in by comparison. So as I said, I've got 8 of them in. What I'm doing now is I'm putting the engine mount in on this side, and that'll stabilize the engine on this side of the car, and then I'm going to get the engine mount for the rear of the engine and all the other bits and pieces that need to happen on the other side of the engine, including the cabling that I took off the subframe and the exhaust, little exhaust mounts, all those stuff. That's a whole cluster of jobs to do on the other side of the engine, so I'm going to do all those together over there. Get the drive shafts in, and then worry about water hoses, get the power steering pump back in, get my brake fluid reservoir, or not my brake fluid, my power steering reservoir located here somewhere, and really start progressing towards getting this thing finished. But it's really more about the order in which I do things, and just thinking ahead about what I need to do down the line, and not tie myself up and get ahead of myself and do the wrong jobs in the wrong order at this point. I've encountered one of those problems that can stop everything dead. And this is the bit about working on cars that is frustrating. Everything's zipping along, and then you come across a job that should take 5 seconds, that had you realized this was a problem a day or two ago, you could have dealt with it on the bench, but now it's in the car and it's too late to deal with it, so you've no choice but to crack on and try and solve it on the field, as it were. So this is the issue. So this is the spare, the old CSC, the slave cylinder, and obviously it's driven by hydraulic fluid, and that has to be fed into this. I'm going to put the phone down here just to explain this, but that has to be fed into the cylinder using a connector and a lead. And normally the way this thing works is you slot that in like that, put a little clip in there, job's done. Well, I never offered it up beforehand because I had a little cover in it and I didn't want to mess with it, and they say not to mess with the CSC in case you get air bubbles or whatever in it. So I took the little plastic cap that was out, went to go slot this in, and boom, it gets in that far and it stops. So the opening here on the new CSC is smaller than the one on the original one, and you can see I've scuffed that up pretty badly. I've used my Dremel to try and open it out a little bit. I've used my Dremel to take the little slight edge off this one to see if I can get it in there, and nothing has worked so far. So, and I've been well over an hour working at this stage, and this is how long it should take. Click, snip, done. And yet here we are an hour and a half later, no further down the line. So I think the only option I have now is to grind back this a little bit and see if I can make it fit that way. If I get it completely wrong, I have a spare one of these because there was one with the replacement gearbox as well. Hopefully that'll work. If it doesn't, I really don't fancy taking this gearbox off again. So it's coming up on 5 o'clock. I've been out here since about 8, although I did take a little break in the middle of the day to have lunch and do a click and collect. So I haven't been out the entire day, but I've been out here probably 7 hours today, and it's been a day of give and take. Some of the jobs which should have been really easy, like putting in this, just clicking in the clutch line, that ended up being a nightmare because this little thing wouldn't fit. So I had to sand this, and eventually used a hand file to sand it down bit by bit by bit by bit until it finally clicked in. And I still don't know if it's going to work or not, which is a bit worrying because it's hydraulic fluid, and if it doesn't work it's going to be a mess. So that's going to make me unhappy. I'm disappointed in that. That's a Vallejo kit. I spent good money on that kit, and that should have just been a click and fit. So a bit annoyed at that, to be fair. Another thing that went a bit askew was I put the gear linkage in and went in to test it, and it was fine left and right, but fore and aft was really stiff. It turns out that the gear cable itself had gotten just water in it somehow. It was just wet and sludgy and rusty in there. So I've spent the last kind of 15 minutes going back and forth in the car and putting silicone spray to loosen it up, and then I'm going to put grease down it to get it right. But the two of those things were annoying. But on the flip side of it, the starter motor, which was something that I spent a long time fighting with when I was taking the car apart, that popped in a couple of minutes. Gearbox switch went in fine, the gearbox itself is fine, the engine mounts have gone in reasonably straightforward, all that's been fine. And on the other side, all the routing of the wires and things from the catalytic converter from the O2 sensor back up to the car, all that's gone really well, as has the sort of reattachment and rerouting of all the cables and wires and hoses that are in this knot here. So from that point of view it's gone well, but overall not as much progress as I would have liked today. But I'm in a good place for tomorrow. I will get the engine mount in at the back of the engine. I will button down the last of the gearbox bolts, and if I get that far before the night draws in, I'll call that a win. So that that stiff gear problem that I had hasn't gone away. I think the cable has developed like basically a hydraulic lock problem, because if I work it hard, it goes away, it gets light, and quite manageable. I mean, it's not exactly... Actually, if I work it really hard, it's a bit of a weird video, but anyway, if I work it really, really hard, it's quite manageable. But as soon as I leave it, even for a little bit, it immediately starts to stiffen up. I mean, that's like... That is not... immediately gets really difficult to move, like really bad. And the cable isn't connected to anything in the engine bay. The cable is loose. So this is where it is. And you know, I've tried oiling it and greasing it and doing all that stuff to it, and nothing makes a difference. So, you know, there it is. I mean, it's a hydraulic lock of some description, and it was fine before I took everything off. I didn't undo anything. I didn't undo the seal around it or anything. I just don't understand. You can hear it squelching. Look at that. I just don't understand how that happened to it. I just don't understand. I'm going to have a look around, see if I can find a solution to this problem. And if not, if I got to replace that cable, Jesus Christ. I mean, it just disappears into the back of the bulkhead, the very area that I've just filled everything in. Put the power steering, the subframe, everything's gone back in there. And it's right there. That's where the cable goes through. Right there. Hates me, this car. If you remember when I was working on the Lotus, I often said how it was a car that wanted to come back to life. It was all the time working with me, and even today I had it out in the sunshine, and it's just, even the hot start issue is slowly improving. It's a car that wants to be alive. This, on the other hand, has fought me every step of the way and continues to do so. You remember yesterday it took me ages to get this line to fit. The replacement CSC nozzle back there wasn't the right connection for the car, so I had to spend a long time just very gradually shaving it back so it would fit in it and make a tight seal. Came out this morning, put brake fluid in it and bled it using my little bleeding tool. This is what I use. This is a weeder. It's for spreading weeds, but basically it's just a little electric pump run by 4 batteries. I just made a little adapter on the end of it, so instead of sucking weed killer out of a container, it could suck fluid through, brake fluid and clutch fluid through a little nozzle. So I used that to bleed it, and it worked, and it seems to be holding, and the clutch feels nice and light, and I'm really happy with all that. Buoyed on by this success, I thought, well, let me do the brakes next. I start bleeding the brakes. Went to take off the first bleed screw, bleed nipple, and off it snapped. So I spent the next, couple of hours then gradually trying to coax it out, drilling it out in various sizes, and it was really important that I didn't damage the seat, and I think I just about got away with that. That's the little seat at the end of the bleed nipple that normally sits in the end there. So I think I got it out. I've put another one in from the other side, just threaded it in, and it seems to be holding, but until I get that fully pressurized, I won't know. And if it hasn't worked, then I'm going to have to get a replacement caliper. And the other thing I'm going to have to get a replacement for is this gear linkage cable. The shifter cable is just super stiff, and it's not getting any better. I don't know why that is. It was fine before, but now it's a nightmare. Super heavy, and it's not going to get any better. So now I've got to get down in here behind the dashboard to try and get that out. Unsurprisingly, changing out the shifter cables is not a straightforward job. On both ends they have these, well, I thought they were rather clever when I saw them initially, but actually they're kind of convoluted little connectors that they use for locking them into the brackets. But because of these, it's absolutely impossible to pull the cable through cleanly. There's a tiny gap back there at the bottom of the dashboard into the firewall, and in the engine bay it's almost, well, it's invisible. I can't really see it. I'll I'll try and lead a hand in there. So it's way back in there. That's where they pass through, and I think they're snagging, oops, on the heat shield. So I'm gonna have to go underneath the car and undo the heat shield above the catalytic converter to see if I can make some space to pass that connector through. But it's just another completely annoying, unnecessary job that is not only going to cost me money, but is adding hours to this job and making me take things apart I didn't want to take apart. So I'm kind of close to having enough now at this stage. So I'm going to fight with that, get it out, and then I'm going to walk away. It's a lovely day. I'm not going to waste my day arguing with this thing. It doesn't want to come back to life, then I'm not going to push it. I'm going to do some of that. Well, they're out. Naturally, they're joined, so you can't just take one out and replace it. You have to do both. And this one here is the left to right movement of the gear levers. So when you move your gear lever left to right, that moves that cable in and out like that, and that works fine. Before and aft, that one, it's like it's been set in quick dry cement. It is not going anywhere. No idea why this has happened. It was fine before I took everything off, but it's developed some sort of a hydraulic lock. So, but I mean, they're animals. They're great cables because they're steel. They're bits of steel. So they really. That's why, you know, Fords have such a good gear change, because it's such a strong linkage. But Jesus, what a job to get it out. So down here behind the dashboard, I don't know if you can see that in there, but that tiny hole, that's where they have to pass through. And in fact, the little mechanism got broken coming through, so that doesn't bode well for getting a new one in. Jesus, if I break a new one trying to put it in, I think I will cry. And now, if you don't mind, we're going to get in underneath the car so you can see the horrific gap. It had to come out and, excuse me, a little bit intimate. Apologies for that. Right, so up there, that's the heat shield. There's a catalytic converter. There's the heat shield, and in through there, if I can get a hand in, that's the gap in there that it has to pass through. I can't even see where it passes through. I had to unbolt the heat shield to make enough space for it to get through. But oh my god, what a faff. What an unnecessarily difficult, shitty job, if I'm honest with you. So that's kind of put a stop on everything else at the top of the engine bay, because to access the cables is down in through there. It's the zone of work. No matter what I do, I can't seem to be able to escape this bloody part of the car. I was hoping to maybe get this car at the very least moving under its own steam and off the axle stands this weekend, but unfortunately I'm now waiting on more parts to come in. This time it's the shifter cables, and I really can't progress anything in this area because down there in this zone of work is where those cables need to pass through. So there's really no point putting everything in here, because I'm just going to have to tear it all apart again to get in there. When it all does need to go back together, it should all go back together pretty quickly, because really all that's left is just bits of plastic. That's with shrouding and the air intake and all that kind of stuff. The only tricky bits left to do are the power steering reservoir. I have the auxiliary belt still to put in, but that's a really quick job. It's nice and easy on this car, actually. I've got a throttle body to put in. So the only thing really left for me to do today is that auxiliary belt and put the power steering pump in. Here's the pump. That bolts onto the front of the engine here, nice and conveniently. That's why I have the headlamp out of the way. I've already got its nice new adapter on here. This is where the old reservoir used to go directly onto the pump. The new one will be located over here somewhere. So I've got a nice fat hose to attach to that and clamp it on. I'll put that in there, route it through, and then that's pretty much it. I might pop the headlamps in, or at least very least sit them in there out of my way. But that's really it. I just have to wait for my bits to come in. I had hoped, as I said, to finish this weekend, but alas, the Fiesta had other plans, so it rolls on for another week.